This video goes over Document D of the Mexican-American War, DBQ. How does this war have to do with slavery? The author of this document was Charles Sumner. He was a politician who was against slavery, and here you see him pictured later on in life. He is probably most famous for being part of the caning in the U.S. Senate before the Civil War, where one of the Southern senators beat Charles Sumner with a cane until his skull was fractured in several places. He took quite a while to recover. He did eventually return to the Senate. But this document was written before he was in the U.S. Senate. He was a state legislator in Massachusetts. He wrote this document as a way to express his and the state of Massachusetts' opinions about the war in Mexico. So the context: it was written during the war between the U.S. and Mexico. The U.S. Congress and the people of the United States are the audience, and the purpose is the Massachusetts State Legislature voted to approve this statement to explain why they thought the U.S. should not be fighting a war against Mexico. This document was passed by the Massachusetts Legislature in 1847. So a little more context about what was going on in 1847. There were 15 slave states and 14 free states, and there had been for several years. So the people of Massachusetts were in one of those free states. They did not want the slave states to have a majority in the Senate and the House. At this point, the free states had the majority in the House of Representatives. The slave states had the majority in the Senate. If that changed enough, and there were enough people in the House, then the free states could be outvoted, and slavery could be allowed everywhere, including in states that wanted it to not have slavery. Same thing could happen the other way, but if you look at the map, you see there's a lot more blue territory, which is intended to be free territory, free states eventually, than there is territory down here that would be pink, which would be slave states. But if all of Mexico was added, it would add a whole lot of land down here off of my screen, making it so there was more slave territory than there was free territory if the Missouri Compromise line was still followed. Because the Missouri Compromise had said everything below this line would be slave and everything north of this line would be free. Now clearly Texas did not actually follow that Missouri Compromise line. But in 1846, a senator had proposed something called the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso said any territory conquered from Mexico in this war would not allow slavery, that it would be free territory. If it had passed, Massachusetts would have said, okay, we're not spreading slavery, we're not expanding slavery by gaining territory here. They might have been a little less concerned. But the Wilmot Proviso had failed in 1846, and it was being brought up again for another vote in 1847. And so the Massachusetts legislature was putting their thoughts out there, hoping that the U.S. Congress would listen to them and pass the Wilmot Proviso, or listen to them and stop the war with Mexico. In April of 1847, in terms of what was happening in the war, it really looked like the U.S. would probably take over all of Mexico. The U.S. already controlled pretty much all of northern Mexico. In southern Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula and that region, there were several different groups who were rebelling against the Mexican government on their own. And the U.S. military was marching through central Mexico toward Mexico City. And they were winning the battles pretty quickly. And it really looked like they would take firm control of Mexico soon. Now, central Mexico put up a bigger resistance than expected, and so that didn't end up happening. But in April of 1847, it really looked like the U.S. might just take control of all of Mexico. So we're looking at Document D. This is Charles Sumner writing the Objections to the Mexican-American War. It was adopted by the Massachusetts State Legislature in 1847. Sumner was a young state legislator from Massachusetts who later served 24 years in the Senate. Remember that he later served in the U.S. Senate. How do you get there? That helps you answer a question later on in the document. Right now, let's take a look at the text of the document. So looking at paragraphs 1 and 2, we have some vocabulary words over here. Mexico, on achieving her independence of the Spanish crown, decreed the abolition of human slavery within her dominions, embracing the province of Texas. Okay, so several things there. Mexico on achieving independence of the Spanish crown. So when Mexico became independent from Spain, Mexico declared the abolition or end of human slavery within her dominions in all the lands of Mexico, including the state of Texas. So did Mexico allow slavery? Yes or no? At this period, citizens of the United States had already begun to move into Texas. The idea was that this extensive province ought to become part of the United States. So citizens of the United States were moving into Texas with the idea that this large state should become part of the United States. And finally, we have paragraph 3. This is a longer one. So it talks about a current of emigration. Emigration, starting with an E, is people moving out of the United States. The Ordinance of Freedom is a reference to that law outlawing slavery in Mexico. Discontented means unhappy. And then we have this phrase, excited the lust of territorial robbery in the public mind. That means they got the public opinion excited. They got the people excited with the idea of territorial robbery would be stealing land. All right, so Charles Sumner has a very strong opinion on what exactly is happening here. So let's read this last paragraph. A current of immigration soon followed from the United States. So this is soon after Americans were moving there with the idea that Texas ought to become part of the United States. So once again, a lot of people moving out soon followed from the United States. Slaveholders crossed the river between Louisiana and Texas with their slaves in defiance of the Mexican Ordinance or Law of Freedom, outlawing slavery. Restless spirits, discontented at home, joined them. The work of rebellion sped. Our newspapers excited the lust of territorial robbery in the public mind. Certainly Mexico might justly charge our citizens with disgraceful robbery, while in seeking extension of slavery, our own citizens denied the great truths of American freedom. A note at the bottom says, according to the early Texas census, there were 130,000 white people and 38,000 slaves in the state in 1847 at the time this was written. Go back and listen to the reading again and the discussion again if you need to. After you've finished writing the summary, paragraph by paragraph then, go ahead and answer the document questions. At the beginning of the video, we talked about what's the big deal. They were afraid that there would be more, free or slave states. Have a good rest of your day.